When people hear the word archetype, they often imagine something distant, ancient, or wrapped in mythology. But an archetype is not powerful because it belongs to myth. It is powerful because it names a pattern the human mind already recognizes before it can fully explain it. You do not need a lecture to understand what a guardian is. The word itself begins gathering images, behaviors, memories, expectations, and emotional signals into one recognizable shape. That is the first thing to understand clearly. An archetype compresses complexity. It takes a wide field of behavior, motive, posture, instinct, and meaning, then gives it a form the mind can carry. When you hear teacher, you do not only think of a person standing at the front of a room. You may feel guidance, correction, patience, authority, transmission, memory, disappointment, inspiration, or even resistance. One word opens an entire inner library. This is not because the word is magical. It is because the mind is built to recognize patterns faster than it analyzes details. Long before a person can describe every trait someone is showing, they can often sense what role that person is playing. They may not say, "This person is representing a protective boundary function inside the group." They simply say, "He is acting like the protector," or "She became the guide in that moment." The archetype gives the pattern a body before the intellect has finished sorting its parts. You can see this in ordinary life with almost no effort. In a family, one person becomes the peacemaker, another becomes the rebel, another becomes the responsible one, another becomes the one who disappears. These are not always official roles, and no one has to announce them for everyone to fill them. The group begins organizing around them because human beings track role energy instinctively. We do not only hear what people say, we sense the pattern they keep returning to. That is why archetypes are not fictional characters in the shallow sense. A character can express an archetype, but the archetype is larger than the character. The wise elder appears in thousands of stories because people keep encountering the pattern of wisdom carried by age, loss, patience, and long seeing. The trickster appears again and again because chaos, humor, disruption, exposure, and reversal are recurring forces in human life. The wounded healer appears because many people discover that their deepest pain becomes the place from which they can recognize pain in others. The forms change, but the patterns remain. Once you understand this, you stop treating archetypes as decorative names and begin seeing them as information containers. They hold memory that is too wide for a flat definition. They allow a person to recognize a full field of meaning without needing every piece explained separately. A guardian is not just someone who protects. A guardian carries threshold, discernment, loyalty, warning, sacrifice, boundary, and the burden of standing between what is vulnerable and what may harm it. That is too much to explain every time, so the mind compresses it into a figure. This compression is useful because consciousness cannot hold every detail at once. Human beings need patterns that make reality navigable. If every experience had to be interpreted from scratch, we will be overwhelmed by the complexity of living. Archetypes help the mind group recurring human energies into recognizable forms. They are like living shorthand, not shallow shorthand, but deep shorthand, because what is compressed inside them can expand again when needed. This is why a single archetypal image can do more than a long explanation. Show someone a figure standing at a gate with a lantern, and the mind begins assembling meaning before any words appear. It senses passage, protection, uncertainty, guidance, and the possibility that the person approaching the gate is not the same person who will leave it. You could explain each of those ideas separately, but the image holds them together instantly. The archetype does not replace thought. It gathers thought into a shape the whole being can approach. But this also means archetypes can be misunderstood when people take them too literally or use them too loosely. If someone says guardian, teacher, architect, healer, or wanderer without connecting the word to a real pattern, the archetype becomes empty decoration. It may sound meaningful, but it does not reveal anything. The strength of an archetype depends on its relationship to lived experience. If the listener cannot eventually recognize the pattern in life, memory, behavior, or perception, the archetype has not compressed meaning. It has only borrowed importance. That distinction matters because a mature symbolic system should not use archetypes merely to make itself sound grand. It should use them because they help the listener understand complex movement. When a teaching says architect, it should reveal the pattern of one who designs structure before others can inhabit it. When it says guardian, it should reveal the pattern of one who protects thresholds and preserves integrity. When it says teacher, it should reveal the pattern of one who translates unseen order into receivable understanding. The name should carry function. If it does not carry function, it becomes costume. You may notice how often people suffer because they are living inside an archetype unconsciously. Someone may spend years playing savior, believing they are simply being loving. Someone may live as the exile, interpreting every distance as proof they do not belong. Someone may become the warrior in every room, even when no battle is present. Someone may carry the orphan pattern so deeply that support feels suspicious when it finally arrives. These are not just personalities. They are repeated symbolic roles organizing perception from beneath the surface. This is where archetypes become practical instead of abstract. They help a person see the role they have been inhabiting before the role becomes their entire identity. When you can name the pattern, you can begin to relate to it instead of being swallowed by it. The savior can ask why they need others to need them. The exile can ask whether solitude is truth or familiar pain. The warrior can ask whether defense is still necessary. The orphan can ask whether distrust is protection or inheritance. Naming the archetype creates distance, and distance creates choice. That does not mean every human experience should be reduced to archetypes. People are more complex than any symbolic role. But archetypes help reveal the recurring structures that shape how people move through complexity. They are not cages when used properly. They are lenses. A lens is dangerous only when someone forgets they are looking through it. Used consciously, it clarifies. Used unconsciously, it can quietly replace the world with one interpretation of the world. This is why archetypes must remain flexible. A person may carry the teacher in one season, the student in another, the guardian in one relationship, the wanderer in another, the healer in one part of life, and the wounded child in another. The human being is not one archetype. The human being is a field where many patterns rise, recede, combine, conflict, and mature. The trouble begins when someone freezes around one image and mistakes that image for their total self. Then the archetype stops revealing them and starts limiting them. A good teaching helps the listener notice movement between archetypes rather than worship a single role. It shows that the guardian may need the innocence of the child. The teacher may need the humility of the student. The architect may need the wildness of the creator. The healer may need the boundary of the warrior. Each archetype reveals a pattern, but no single pattern can hold the whole of a living person. The deeper work is not choosing one symbolic identity forever. It is learning which pattern is active, what it is serving, and whether it still belongs. This also explains why archetypes appear so naturally inside stories. A story needs movement, and archetypes carry movement. The mentor does not only stand there being wise. The mentor appears when the seeker cannot cross the next threshold alone. The shadow does not merely exist as darkness. The shadow reveals what has been denied, repressed, feared, or misused. The threshold guardian does not simply block the path. The guardian tests whether the one approaching has actually become ready for what they are trying to enter. This is why archetypes are so efficient for teaching transformation. They do not only describe people, they describe functions in a process. A person may be the seeker at the beginning, the rebel in the middle, the builder after collapse, and the guide after integration. The same life can move through many symbolic forms because transformation is not static. Archetypes help track the movement of identity as it changes shape. They let the listener see that inner development is not random emotion. It often has pattern, sequence, pressure, resistance, and consequence. Once this becomes clear, the phrase cognitive compression becomes more than an actual idea. It means the mind has a way of folding wide fields of meaning into portable forms. The archetype is portable, but it is not small. It travels as a single image, name, or role, yet when opened, it contains psychology, memory, behavior, story, and implication. This is why one person can say, "I have been living as the rescuer," and an entire life pattern can suddenly become visible. That sentence may carry more truth than a long explanation because it reveals the organizing shape beneath many separate events. And when the organizing shape becomes visible, the listener begins to understand themselves with more precision. They stop asking only, "Why did this happen again?" and begin asking, "What role did I unconsciously step into?" They stop seeing every event as isolated and begin noticing repeated forms. They recognize that the same archetype can wear different faces across different years, different relationships, different jobs, different conflicts, but the same inner posture returning. That recognition does not solve everything, but it gives the person a clearer place to begin. This is why archetypes matter in any teaching that uses symbolic figures. The figures are not there merely to populate a mythology. They are there to carry patterns that would become too heavy or too abstract if explained only as concepts. A guardian, a teacher, an architect, a witness, a keeper, a wanderer, a bridge, a mirror, a flame, a threshold. Each one holds a field of meaning that can be approached through image, then unfolded through understanding. The image gives the listener entry. The teaching gives the image discipline. Together, they make complexity receivable without reducing it to something thin. But the next layer is even more important. If archetypes compress meaning, then the question becomes who is doing the compressing, and what gets included or excluded when a pattern is given a name. Because every archetype teaches attention. It tells the listener what to notice and what to connect. It makes some meanings visible while leaving others in the background. That means archetypes are never neutral decorations. They are instruments of perception. And once a person begins to see them that way, they can no longer meet symbolic figures as mere characters standing inside a story. Once you understand archetypes as instruments of perception, you begin to see why they have to be handled with more precision than ordinary labels. A label points at something. An archetype gathers a field around it. If you call someone angry, you are naming a mood, a behavior, or a state. But if you call someone the warrior, you are invoking protection, conflict, discipline, courage, aggression, sacrifice, and the possibility that life itself is being interpreted as a battlefield. The word does not just describe the person, it starts arranging how the person is seen. That is why archetypal language can clarify quickly, but can also distort quickly. It compresses so much meaning that one wrong compression can mislead the listener into seeing more pattern than is actually there. Someone who sets a boundary may not be a warrior. They may simply be tired. Someone who leaves a relationship may not be the exile. They may be choosing peace. Someone who questions a group may not be the rebel. They may be the only one still paying attention. Archetypes help us recognize patterns, but they should not force life into a role before life has shown its shape. This is where discernment enters the teaching. The mind loves quick recognition because recognition feels like understanding. But quick recognition is not always deep seeing. Sometimes the mind grabs the nearest familiar pattern and places it over reality too soon. This happens in relationships all the time. A person meets someone who reminds them of an old wound, an old protector, an old authority, or an old disappointment, and the archetype arrives before the person has been fully seen. The past compresses the present into a familiar role. When that happens, archetypes are no longer serving perception. They are taking over perception. The person is not meeting reality as it is unfolding. They are meeting reality through a stored symbolic expectation. This is why one person can experience a boss as a tyrant, a partner as a betrayer, a friend as a rescuer, or a stranger as a threat before enough evidence exists. The archetype has been activated by resemblance. The mind is not inventing randomly. It is trying to protect itself through pattern recognition. But protection can become projection when it moves too fast. This matters because archetypes do not only live in stories. They live in the nervous system, the memory field, the imagination, and the social body. A child who grows up around unstable authority may become highly sensitive to the tyrant pattern. A person who was abandoned may recognize the vanishing figure everywhere. Someone who was praised only for usefulness may become attached to the servant, fixer, or savior role. None of this is foolish. It is the mind trying to organize pain into patterns it can anticipate. But what helps someone survive can later begin limiting what they are able to perceive. That is why conscious archetypal work is not about collecting impressive titles. It is about learning which patterns are active, why they are active, and whether they still tell the truth. The question is not, which archetype am I? The better question is, which pattern keeps interpreting life before I have fully arrived in it? That question opens more honesty. It stops the person from turning an archetype into a costume. It brings the archetype back to its proper function, a lens that reveals, not a mask that replaces. A lens is useful because it focuses attention, but every lens also excludes something. When you see through the guardian, you notice thresholds, danger, responsibility, and protection. When you see through the healer, you notice pain, repair, listening, and restoration. When you see through the architect, you notice design, structure, sequence, and consequence. Each perspective is valuable, but none is total. If you look through one lens for too long, you may begin mistaking its emphasis for the whole of reality. You can feel the implication of this in ordinary situations. The guardian may enter a room and notice what could go wrong before noticing what is already safe. The healer may sense another person's pain before sensing their strength. The teacher may turn every conversation into a lesson before allowing the moment to simply breathe. The architect may see the system behind everything and forget that human beings are not only systems to be arranged. The archetype gives a gift, but every gift can become imbalanced when it is not balanced by another way of seeing. This is why mature symbolic teaching must show both the strength and the shadow of an archetype. If it only praises the guardian, it may train hypervigilance. If it only praises the healer, it may train overextension. If it only praises the rebel, it may confuse reaction with freedom. If it only praises the mystic, it may allow avoidance to dress itself as depth. A true teaching does not flatter the archetype. It reveals what the archetype makes possible and what becomes dangerous when that pattern becomes unconscious. That is also why archetypes are not meant to become identities that never change. They are living functions that move through a person according to need, season, maturity, and circumstance. A person may need the warrior to leave a harmful situation, but they may need the child to receive tenderness afterward. They may need the architect to rebuild their life, but they may need the wanderer to discover what no plan could have predicted. They may need the teacher to speak clearly, but they may need the student to keep learning. When archetypes move, the person remains alive. When archetypes freeze, the person begins serving the role instead of the role serving growth. You may notice that much suffering comes from frozen roles. Someone who survived by becoming strong may not know how to be held. Someone who survived by becoming useful may not know how to exist without earning their place. Someone who survived by becoming invisible may not know how to receive attention without danger rising inside them. These are not random habits. They are archetypal compressions formed under pressure. Life taught the person a role, and the role became so familiar that it began to feel like truth. This is where archetypal language can become deeply compassionate when used well. It does not reduce a person to a diagnosis or blame them for a pattern. It says, there is a form you learn to inhabit, and that form once had a reason. That kind of seeing can soften shame. It can help a person recognize that the fixer, the fighter, the ghost, the caretaker, the judge, or the wanderer did not arise from nowhere. The pattern was built, and what was built can be understood, refined, and eventually released when it no longer served the life trying to emerge. But again, the release does not come from rejecting the archetype. It comes from restoring proportion. The warrior does not need to die because the person no longer wants to fight every run. The warrior needs to become available instead of dominant. The healer does not need to vanish because the person is learning boundaries. The healer needs to become wise enough to know when healing is not theirs to perform. The teacher does not need to be silenced because not every moment is a lesson. The teacher needs to learn when presence teaches more than explanation. This is why archetypes are information containers but not fixed prisons. They hold pattern, but they do not have to dictate destiny. They give the mind a way to recognize recurring forms, but they should always return the listener to direct experience. If the archetype makes a person less available to see nuance, it has become too rigid. If it makes a person more able to see nuance, it is functioning properly. The proof is not how powerful the word sounds. The proof is whether the word increases contact with reality. That contact with reality is the real test of every symbolic figure. When a teaching introduces a guardian, a keeper, a mirror, a threshold, a flame, or a guide, the listener should eventually be able to feel what human pattern is being made visible. The figure should not float above life as decoration. It should return to something recognizable. It should help the listener notice how protection functions, how memory functions, how reflection functions, how transformation functions, how guidance functions. If the figure cannot return to life, it remains beautiful but weak. This is especially important in a symbolic system that contains many beings, roles, realms, or inner architectures. The danger is not that symbolic figures exist. The danger is that the listener may begin collecting them without understanding what they reveal. 1,000 names can become noise if none of them clarifies perception. But one well-formed archetype can become a doorway if it helps a person recognize a pattern they have been living inside for years. Depth is not created by abundance alone. Depth is created when each image carries function, consequence, and lived meaning. That means the role of the teaching is to keep opening the container. The archetype compresses meaning, but the teaching decompresses it. It shows what is inside the name. It reveals the behavior, the tension, the gift, the shadow, the developmental movement, and the real-life implication. Without that unfolding, the archetype stays ornamental. With it, the archetype becomes a bridge between image and understanding. This is the balance. Compression gives the listener entry, and explanation gives the entry direction. Once you begin seeing archetypes this way, you also begin seeing why human beings respond so strongly to symbolic figures in stories, dreams, religions, films, family systems, and personal memory. We are not only responding to characters, we are responding to condensed patterns of life. The villain carries distortion, domination, wound, hunger, or shadow. The guide carries transmission, timing, and the possibility of crossing. The child carries innocence, vulnerability, beginning, and forgotten truth. The king or queen carries sovereignty, order, responsibility, and the burden of center. These figures endure because the patterns they hold keep returning in human experience. And yet the deepest implication is still waiting underneath this. If archetypes compress experience into recognizable form, then every culture, every family, every spiritual system, every political movement, and every personal identity is constantly deciding which patterns deserve names and which patterns remain invisible. What we name becomes easier to see. What we do not name can continue operating in silence. That means archetypes are not only tools for understanding stories, they are tools for revealing the hidden roles shaping perception before a person ever realizes they are inside one. What we name becomes easier to see, And this is why archetypes shape awareness long before a person realizes they are using them. A culture that has a strong image for the hero will notice courage, sacrifice, victory, and struggle very quickly. A culture that has a strong image for the healer will notice wounds, repair, tenderness, and restoration with more sensitivity. A family that has a strong role for the responsible one will keep finding someone to carry what others refuse to carry. The name does not create the whole pattern, but it gives the pattern a place to gather. This means archetypes do not only describe reality after the fact, they help train attention before the fact. Once a pattern has a name, the mind begins scanning for it. It starts linking separate behaviors into one recognizable form. It notices the way someone stands at the edge of the room, the way they intervene in conflict, the way they avoid need, the way they speak when pressure arrives. What once looked like scattered traits begins to reveal an organizing shape. That is the gift of archetypal perception. But the same gift can become dangerous if the mind begins scanning too aggressively. When the pattern becomes more important than the person, perception starts shrinking. The listener stops discovering and starts assigning. They stop watching what is actually happening and begin forcing each person, event, or feeling into an already available category. This is how a tool of understanding becomes a quiet form of control. The archetype should help reality speak more clearly, not make reality say only what the archetype allows. You can feel this most clearly in relationships. Someone may decide early that another person is the betrayer, the rescuer, the teacher, the threat, or the answer. After that decision, every action gets interpreted through the chosen role. Kindness from the supposed betrayer is treated as manipulation. Imperfection from the supposed rescuer feels like abandonment. Correction from the supposed teacher feels sacred even when it should be questioned. The archetype has become a filter so strong that the living person can no longer fully appear. This is why maturity requires the ability to revise the archetype. A pattern may be present, but it may not be complete. A person may carry guardian energy in one situation and fear in another. They may teach clearly in one moment and avoid intimacy in the next. They may appear as a guide because they know one road, but be entirely lost on another. Archetypal seeing becomes truthful only when it stays responsible to new evidence. The pattern should remain alive enough to change as reality reveals more of itself. The same principle applies inwardly. A person may discover that they have been living as the exile, and that recognition may bring real clarity. They may suddenly understand why belonging has felt dangerous, why distance has felt familiar, and why being misunderstood has become part of their identity. But if they cling to the exile too tightly, they may begin protecting the very wound they are trying to outgrow. The archetype that once revealed the pattern can later preserve it. This is why every symbol that awakens recognition must eventually be examined for whether it is still serving freedom. This examination does not require rejecting the symbol. It requires asking what the symbol is doing now. Is it revealing a pattern that needs care, or is it becoming a place to hide? Is it helping the person understand their history, or is it turning history into destiny? Is it opening compassion, or is it creating a more poetic excuse to remain unchanged? These questions keep archetypal language honest. Without them, even beautiful names can become elegant prisons. A true archetype has depth because it holds both wound and possibility. The exile is not only rejected, the exile may also learn to see from outside the center. The warrior is not only defensive, the warrior may preserve what would otherwise be destroyed. The healer is not only wounded, the healer may transform suffering into recognition. The architect is not only controlling, the architect may give form to what would otherwise remain scattered. When the archetype is opened fully, it does not flatten a person. It shows the tension inside a pattern and the direction in which that pattern can mature. This is why archetypes are more like seeds than statues. A statue freezes meaning into one posture. A seed contains a form that can unfold under the right conditions. If an archetype is treated like a statue, the person begins bowing to a fixed image of themselves. If it is treated like a seed, the person asks what it is trying to grow through this pattern. The same word can either imprison or liberate depending on whether it is used as a final identity or an unfolding intelligence. You can see this difference in how people speak about themselves. One person says, "I am just the caretaker," and the statement closes around them. Another says, "I notice the caretaker pattern rising in me when I feel afraid of being unwanted," and the statement opens a doorway. The first sentence turns the archetype into fate. The second turns it into observation. Observation restores movement, and wherever movement returns, transformation becomes possible again. This is one of the deepest reasons archetypes matter in teaching. They give people a way to observe themselves without becoming lost in shame or abstraction. Instead of saying, "Something is wrong with me," a person can say, "A pattern is active in me." That small shift changes the entire atmosphere of self-understanding. It creates enough distance for honesty, but not so much distance that the person becomes detached from responsibility. They can see the role, feel its history, and still choose how to relate to it now. That kind of seeing is not fantasy. It is practical perception. A person who recognizes the martyr pattern can begin noticing when giving has become a hidden bargain. A person who recognizes the judge pattern can begin hearing how fear hides inside certainty. A person who recognizes the wanderer pattern can begin asking whether movement is discovery or escape. A person who recognizes the child pattern can begin honoring vulnerability without letting immaturity lead. Each archetype reveals a different doorway into self-awareness, but the doorway must be walked through, not worshiped. This also clarifies why archetypes are useful in a larger symbolic framework. When a teaching uses beings, roles, realms, or symbolic figures, it is not automatically asking the listener to believe in characters as literal entities. It may be giving complex patterns a form that can be approached, remembered, and revisited. The figure becomes a concentration point for meaning. It allows the teaching to say more than a flat concept can carry. But the figure must remain accountable to the pattern it represents. If it cannot be connected back to awareness, behavior, memory, consequence, or transformation, then it has lost its teaching function. That is the difference between symbolic architecture and decorative mythology. Decorative mythology multiplies figures without deepening perception. Symbolic architecture gives each figure a role, a function, a tension, and a way of revealing something the listener can actually use. It does not ask the listener to get lost in the names. It asks them to notice what the names are making visible. The being is not the end point. The realm is not the end point. The symbol is not the end point. The end point is clearer perception, deeper recognition, and a more honest relationship with reality. Once this is understood, archetypes stop being treated as old mythic figures from distant stories and start becoming visible everywhere. They appear in the workplace, in friendships, in family systems, in political movements, in art, in memory, in spiritual longing, and in the private roles people secretly perform for survival. They appear when someone becomes the voice of reason in a chaotic room. They appear when someone becomes the scapegoat for what no one wants to face. They appear when someone becomes the bridge between two groups that cannot speak to each other. Life keeps producing these patterns because human experience keeps organizing itself around recurring forms of meaning. And because these forms repeat, they can be studied, not academically alone, but personally and relationally. You can ask which archetypes a family rewards, which ones it punishes, and which ones it refuses to name. You can ask which archetype you perform when you are afraid, which one you admire in others, which one you resent, and which one you secretly wish someone else would carry for you. These questions reveal that archetypes do not only live in stories we watch, they live in the expectations we inherit, the roles we accept, and the identities we protect. This is where archetypes become cognitive compression in the fullest sense. They compress not only information, but emotional memory, social function, personal history, and future possibility. They make complexity portable enough for the mind to hold, but meaningful enough that the soul can feel it. They allow a person to say one word and begin unfolding an entire inner landscape. That is their power, and that is why they require care. A compressed pattern can liberate understanding when opened wisely, or distort understanding when accepted too quickly. So the real question is not whether archetypes are real in the literal sense people often argue about. The more useful question is whether they reveal real patterns. Do they help us notice what has been active beneath the surface? Do they help us understand why the same role keeps appearing in different situations? Do they help us see how story, memory, wound, identity, and perception have been braided together? If they do, then they are not fictional distractions. They are instruments for recognizing the hidden structures through which human beings live. And once those structures become visible, the work deepens. Because the moment you understand that archetypes compress meaning, you also begin to understand that every symbol is doing some kind of compression. Every mythic figure, every repeated image, every sacred role, every inner title, every story shape carries an organizing force. Some compress wisdom, some compress fear, some compress inherited pain, some compress possibility. And the next responsibility is learning how to tell the difference between a symbol that clarifies the human being and a symbol that quietly teaches the human being what they are allowed to become.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.